It's been nearly 9 years since the FDA approved the first cell therapy, and the field has evolved in some very important ways. Since then, we've seen progression from autologous approaches to scalable allogeneic platforms, and we've seen expansion beyond hematologic cancers into solid tumors and autoimmune disease to create better narratives around patient equity and opportunity. From those first CAR T cell therapies, we've seen the growth and in some cases clinical validation of other promising modalities. But today we're here to talk about not just a single modality. We're here to talk about a broader trend. In the last year and a half, we have seen how the safety has been differentiated in terms of profiles for new cell therapy products and have led regulators to agree with several of these cell therapy companies about seeking to amend their protocols to begin outpatient dosing. Since the FDA's first approval for cell therapy in 2017, the administration has been confined largely to major academic centers and facilities that can cover overnight observation and their personnel being able to respond to serious adverse events or other types of sequelae. This has largely limited the access to urban areas for those with the socioeconomic means, the geographic and employment flexibility, and the opportunity to travel sometimes great distances in addition to taking off work. That's really a sizable commitment just to be able to have that therapy. This can't be just at academic centers. This has to be for the rest of our patients and humanity to really bring that honor of serving patients home. Today we do have an incredibly distinguished panel to discuss some of these things and what it may mean for innovation and what it could do for critically ill patients that may not have another opportunity to travel to some destination to get these therapies. Could this be the start of a new movement? We hope so, because if you think about 50 years ago, maybe a blood transfusion in a rural community hospital was unique. That's not the case anymore. Why can't this be us? Why can't cell and gene move into this space? So to help us talk through this opportunity today with our all-star panel, we have the gentleman in the blue teal jacket. This is Paul Hastings. He is a 5-time biotech CEO and a former chair of the BI Global Trade Organization. In his role as CEO of Nkarta, his company is in phase 2 of their Entrust studies to advance an off-the-shelf allogeneic CAR-NK cell therapy candidate to treat autoimmune diseases like lupus, scleroderma, myositis, and rheumatoid arthritis. Paul is passionate, and he's going to tell us about the agreement he announced with FDA last month on outpatient dosing and what that means from a perspective as a CEO, as well as someone living with a severe autoimmune disease. Paul has Crohn's, and he's had it since age 13. And for someone growing up in a community in Maine without the access to clinical therapy, he knows better than anyone what that journey is like. Dr. Guillermo Valenzuela is the founder and medical director of Enroll Rheumatology and Immunology Specialists, also known as IRIS, based in Plantation, Florida, South Florida. Under his nearly 3 decades of leadership, IRIS has built one of the most respected and trusted and prolific R&D programs for major pharma of any practice in the country, a community site. His patients have participated in hundreds of clinical trials, and he has spearheaded pioneering research into cell therapy and other emerging therapies for rheumatic diseases. Dr. David Raziri is the endowed chair at Novant Health Weizsäcker Cancer Institute in Charlotte, North Carolina, where he is senior vice president and physician-in-chief. He's a hem-onc, cell therapist, and clinical professor at the UNC School of Medicine, who balances his time in teaching physicians of tomorrow and advancing clinical research. Gunnar Esiason, Vice President of Patient Strategy and Innovation at Raven, the healthcare incubator for RA Capital, and one of the most influential biotech-focused investment firms in the U.S. Gunnar is a cystic fibrosis patient and an accomplished patient advocate who is passionate about early-stage drug development, patient empowerment, and expanding access. Welcome to all of our panelists today. Thank you so much for being here. So, Paul, I'm going to begin with you. Can you set up the problem statement for this panel and what we're trying to solve for? And potentially, what is that solution and how we can get through that problem?
The first problem is us. I see a few CEOs in the audience. I'm looking at one right now. He's a new CEO, but I'm here to say that we have to stand up. And when we go to hire our CROs to do our clinical trials and work with our clinical and medical teams, we can't just go hire the best academic medical centers to run our clinical trials. It's great, they're wonderful. They enroll about 1 patient a year, by the way, in rheumatology clinical trials. Why? Because about 5 to 10% of patients in the country have access to clinical trials that are in those academic centers. And so those investigators that are doing our trials in these big centers are also doing everybody else's trials in these big centers. And so we get, if we are lucky, a patient a year from a big academic center. This man can enroll 10 patients in 2 months in a community research center. Why? Because he knows them all. They're his patients. Now, not every community center can do what this man does and this man does, but what I'm here to do and what we're working on together, Dr. Valenzuela and I, is to go out there and find other Dr. Valenzuelas to create centers in community areas where indigent patients and other patients who don't have access to clinical trials get access to clinical trials to supplement the great work that the academics are doing in the big medical centers. But there's a difference between the kind of patients that these folks can enroll and the patients academic medical centers enroll. So I'll be controversial for a minute. The academic centers have databases. They go in their database, they find patients in their database. Probably the PI doesn't know that patient, the principal investigator. It's just a patient that's in a database that maybe has come to them through a referral from somebody else. Now that patient deserves to be treated and should be treated. But when that patient walks through the front door of that institution, they're not going to get the same treatment that the patient that walks through the front door of his institution is going to get, which is a waiting room full of friendly people, an infusion center full of stuffed animals and videos instead of, a stark, sterile environment. And so there's a different way of approaching maybe getting different kinds of patients, and maybe focusing on patients that haven't had access to clinical trials in the past would be a very good thing to do. So giving those patients access to those trials will allow us to do these trials more quickly because time is money in biotech. But if you bring it down to the patient level, people have been talking about this for years. Janet Woodcock at the FDA and a member of this audience, who's a Duchenne muscular dystrophy mom, worked together on patient-centric drug development to make sure that patients' voices were heard in the discovery and development phase. So all these things are important and lead us to where we are today, which is to talk about how to set up more of these community centers to supplement the great works academics are doing. So that's what we're here to do today.
Thank you, Paul. Excellent. Dr. Irizarry, you have had an accomplished legacy in academia. When I was a postdoc at Duke, we all looked up to you because you were the cell and gene head at Duke University Medical Center. As you've now moved into that community practice and bring cell therapy to patients from all over North Carolina, and especially rural North Carolina, how do you see this working going forward in terms of what you're doing at Novant and what you think the community needs to do?
It's been an eye-opener for me to move from academia to a large health system, and it's a different way to serve, trying to get quality care into the community, but it's been a great challenge. I don't think there's a difference in the expertise of my colleagues that I'm with now versus Duke. There's a difference in the multiple agendas that pull us away from the patient's bedside each day, though.
Okay.
At Duke, we had other obligations outside of clinic that were constantly making it difficult to get back to the bedside and keep the focus there. In the large health system, my colleagues and I, that's our primary focus, which is really refreshing. Yes. And they're really focused on providing that quality care in the community. But we as physicians actually have a minor role in that. It's all the other supportive care we need. So do you have the right nursing, pharmacy, community support, home support for those patients in the community, and how does that look different? How do you do the home monitoring differently, more effectively? At a large health center, patients are traveling, so they already have a different bar they're meeting. They can travel to you. They can, in a variety of different ways, stay local with a caregiver. In these large health systems, are staying at home. Do they actually have a caregiver? Is their home a safe place for them in the midst of all these therapies? It's a very different set of circumstances we have to evaluate to deliver the therapy in that community.
Yes, sir.
So it's a nice challenge, but one that we're just starting to understand more thoroughly.
Yes, sir, absolutely. And Gunnar, since a very early age, you have led from the front in terms of empowerment, education, advocacy. As we go forward to trying to enroll these studies so that we can get these commercial products to more patients everywhere, what do you see as those challenges? How do you feel about that? How do you advise those companies you work with now?
Looking at the clinical trial infrastructure in the U.S. today, it is clearly strained, right? There is clearly a capacity issue that needs to be addressed. And I think sort of the history of site selection, of choosing your PIs, of choosing where your clinical trial is actually going to be run is historically been a blend of an art and science. And I think moving forward, it will become more of an algorithmic science,
Okay.
right? As sites need to compete with each other to become the site of choice.
Right.
And similarly, I think sponsors need to also, hold up their end of the bargain to become the sponsor of choice for sites that they're working with. I think, to the point that we're talking about here today, bringing trials closer to the community, my team spends a lot of time thinking about the probability of consent. And so what I mean by that is if you hold the patient's motivation and the inclusion-exclusion criteria of a trial constant or aside for a moment, there are a number of factors that go into whether or not a trial is right for a person. Right? We were talking about this before, where it's how different is it from their typical clinic visit?
Yeah.
How accessible is the site? What is the site sponsor or CR doing to support the patient through the entirety of the study? How trustworthy is the physician and the infrastructure at the site? And so all of these things really do go into what we call the probability of consent. And I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done to improve that experience for patients that are considering clinical trials, because we see it every day. The motivation is there to be in studies.
Yes,
Right?
sir.
The motivation is plainly there from patients to get into studies for the most advanced therapies, and yet it's hard, right? It remains hard to be a participant.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that, and thank you for all the work you're doing in that regard. Paul, you have an incredibly provocative and pioneering therapy that can be used in a variety of rheumatologic indications that can bring help and hope to so many patients. At the academic medical centers, there are bottlenecks that we're all sort of discussing here that lead to a variety of operational and financial challenges. Can you speak to what that means for you as the CEO of a pre-revenue company in terms of the hope and the opportunity to bring innovation to these patients that may not occur otherwise?
I'm here to say my site of choice is sitting right to my left. Everybody in my company knows this. Everybody else knows this now too. And I'll tell you why. I spent a day with him in his clinic. I would challenge any CEO or clinical person in this room to go to an academic center and be welcomed to spend a day in their clinic. They're too busy. They have too many other things to do. You're getting fractions of people instead of whole people who are responsible for things. We're spending so much money to get to patients, and then we get roadblocks in institutions. Patients report to me, I happen to be a patient advocate, so I spend a lot of time with patients. And so patients tell me that sometimes they walk through the front door of the institution. They're all excited to go to their clinical trial, and they walk up to the reception desk and they say, I'm here for my clinical trial, and the receptionist goes, what? What trial? Pulls out a notebook, goes through the pages. By the time the patient reaches the clinic, they're late. The PI is not happy. Patient's late for their appointment. Patient's upset because they've never met the PI before. It's a stranger to them. And if you're a patient wearing a teal blue sport coat and wanting to be provocative at times, you're probably going to fire that clinician when that person doesn't treat you the way you want to be treated. And we've seen patients do that with their community docs as well. And they should do that, right? So it's not the fault of the institution. It's that the institution has gotten so large, and that with all the cuts in funding that they're going through, instead of getting a full study coordinator, we might get a 20th of one or a 4th of one. Not the study coordinator's fault, not the PI's fault, right? In cell therapy, There are other dynamics. You have cell therapists and you have rheumatologists, and the patients want to be treated by a rheumatologist, but in some institutions, the cell therapist is the person administering cells. We're allogeneic, off the shelf. We don't require apheresis. We don't require all the handling that a cell therapist needs to be involved in, and they're very important for that kind of involvement in autologous therapies. But for an off-the-shelf drug that looks like an antibody in a vial, where all this guy has to do is thaw the vial and inject it like he does an antibody, he doesn't need a cell therapist. And in an institution, sometimes that's where the patients end up. Instead of in the arms of a rheumatologist, they're in the arms of a cell therapist. And it's not that the cell therapist and the patient don't want to get to know each other and develop that relationship, but the patient's sitting there thinking, I have a autoimmune disease and I'm being treated by an oncologist.
David, as you look at cell therapists in academic medical centers where they're pulled in many different ways now because there are more opportunities to treat, but this has largely historically homed to hem-onc, how can those cell therapists lean into accelerating other indications that may benefit from cell therapy, or do you think there's a different way that will happen?
You all have your same 5 favorite institutions you go to because they've worked with your first-in-human developers at your companies. Yeah, they know each other, they're comfortable, they're trusted. And that's where you go. And so it's a challenge I would throw out to our CRO colleagues that you're paying a lot of money to,
Right.
and our companies. Seek out the new large health systems that are committed to quality, safe conduct of human research, and have the establishments and the collaboration. We had this last year at my new institution at Novant of a rheumatologic cell therapy. The rheumatologists were all on board, my cell therapy team's all on board, love to collaborate. It's very different than the sandbox issues you often get into in academia in terms of who's going to publish, who's going to be on the podium. If you're talking about rheumatology, et cetera, and you're talking about cell therapy of any type, first in human, you don't know that it's not going to be toxic up front. And raise your hand if you've called a rheumatologist at 2 in the morning and they picked up the phone. Right? You can't admit the patient, say, call me if there's a problem with CRS. It ain't going to happen. The cell therapist, this is what we do every day. So we're ready to collaborate. We're at the bedside with the patient 24/7 as needed and can take up the mantle for our colleagues outside of cancer developing these therapies in a collaboration. So, that's my spiel anyway.
Yeah, no, I completely appreciate that. And, just from the vendor side of it, we have had sponsors come to us and say, take us to any place but an academic medical center. So we understand the journey, we understand the importance of what you're trying to change and do. And Dr. Valenzuela, you've kindly shared that you really wanted to do more for these patients from day one, and possibly in the academic setting that was harder to do what you wanted to accomplish. What would you tell to your fellow rheumatologists in the community that want to be able to, to do more in terms of treating these patients?
I will start for the mea culpa, which means that answer the phone at 2 in the morning, own the patient, and do not delegate. Go to the hospital. All our patients go through a phase of complications, named a condition, lupus nephritis. These patients go through the whole system. They're admitted, quickly kicked out as soon as they can. The nephrologist see them. If you're lucky, the nephrologist will call you, unless you establish your own relationships with them. And then you will see that patient. Otherwise, that patient goes into a path of, program well-defined in 5 years, renal insufficiency with most likely needing a transplant. Ask me how many transplanted patients I have under my care right now that could have been saved way before that. All that could have taken is a call and the willingness to go to the hospital. So first, I would say to my own colleagues, let's clean house. Let's take ownership, because the conditions that we are treating now, as you say, certainly require the complexity of the therapies while being in the hospital, especially with the CAR-T. However, now we are envisioning a new era of therapy, as you said, Paul, that these therapies will be able to be delivered at the outpatient setting as I do right now. So with a degree of confidence that they still don't know. Still, my colleagues don't know about what we do. They don't know about the allogenic therapies, the off-the-shelf. So a big role in education is what I do. I'm an educator. I travel everywhere in the world to lecture, and I've been doing that. And sometimes I can't even make it to the clinic because I have a mission to educate my own, so we can have better collaborations where we need to have them, but just to take our own presence there, own our patients, because. Let's be realistic. The rheumatologist is the one who understands these conditions, and we have now one gift, which is new therapies that we can administer ourselves, providing that we educate them, our colleagues, into the process of doing that. There's much more than that, obviously. This is a lengthier process, but it requires dedication of the whole system associated with that doctor to provide the care.
Hey, Chris, do you mind if I just jump in
Sure,
for a
of
second?
course, yes.
Because I want to address a couple of things that came up. So we're CAR and K, we're not CAR T, and one of the things that happens to us is we sometimes get confused. When you inject a CAR T, you inject a small number of cells, they expand over time. And when those cells expand, they release cytokines. David mentioned CRS, cytokine release syndrome. That happens with CAR T. It doesn't happen with CAR and K. So he won't get a phone call, thank God, at 2 a.m. with a CAR and K. We have 0 cytokine release syndrome incidents in our rheumatology trials. We had a small number in our oncology trials, but they were injection site reactions, which were mistaken as CRS, a little fever that can go away that doesn't need IL-6. So with autologous therapy, you absolutely need somebody that understands how to do apheresis, how to do toxicity management with cytokine release syndrome, which is dangerous, really dangerous, by the way. Patient releases cytokines, IL-6, IL-8. These cytokines are dangerous cytokines, right? And so that needs to be handled that way. But with allogeneic therapies, these are off the shelf, and they are now available, as Dr. Valenzuela said, and I don't know, I could ask you, but I already know the answer. He hasn't seen any toxicity with the cells. He's treating 4 billion cells times 3, 12 billion cells. We thought 1 billion cells was the dose. We're now at 12, right? We've dose escalated. And by the way, you also see a dose response, whereas with CAR T, the dose response is in the expansion, right? But with a CAR and K, you've got to get to that maximum dose. When we get there, we may have some toxicities. So far, we haven't seen any. But that's one thing that distinguishes NKs from Ts and relieves that burden. Now, Dr. Valenzuela and I talk about bow tie rheumatologists as well. That's our favorite saying. That's the dude in the academic center with the bow tie, that's been there for years and is established and has his very, set ways. There are younger, and I don't mean to be an ageist here, but there are people graduating with contemporary knowledge. Lots of women coming into this field, by the way, because autoimmune disease affects women, right? Mostly. There are men who have I have Crohn's disease. There are other men who have lupus, but the majority of patients are women. So there are a lot of women graduating that are really interested in serving as well. And so I think the job that we have now, and this whole thing with the CRO and the sites that you mentioned, you go to your CRO and they hand you a list of sites that they've handed everybody else. They don't do any homework. Sorry, Chris. They don't do any homework. They basically give you the list that they have. I could give a damn whether Harvard does our trials or NYU. What I care about is that the patients get treated in the trial.
Excellent points, empirically driven, lived experience. So Paul and Willie, thank you both for that. That's incredibly important. Gunnar, turning to you, what are the smartest companies doing in terms of enrollment, in terms of configuring trials, in terms of access? How does that work?
What's interesting is I come from the world of cystic fibrosis, right? And I've, over the last decade plus, I've been the participant in 4 different studies, right? I was in the Trikafta study, which was an absolute home run if you know anything about CF, but I've also been in studies that have completely failed, or I've been in studies where within 2 weeks it was painfully obvious to me that no one had ever asked a sick person if the design or strategy or the operationalization of the study made any sense whatsoever. And I think that really just requires time, right? That requires time and leadership from the top to actually get it right. Because I think everyone in this room knows sort of like the death knell of a study is the cascade of amendments that happen. Right? It's sort of changing the inclusion criteria and tinkering with that and tinkering with the number of sites, and number of visits, number of assessments, the endpoints, right? God forbid. And sort of a part of preparing and planning for a study necessarily needs to include every aspect of it, from the person who's actually using the drug at the end of the day, the patient, all the way through the operations and admin people at the sites and at the companies as well. I can tell you the last clinical trial that I was in several years ago, over the course of about 18 months, I had 4 different study coordinators, right? And every time a study coordinator changes over, the experience in the clinic changes for the patient, right? You sort of develop a rapport with that person, and that person is an overworked 23-year-old oftentimes, right? Yeah. That's like who they are. And they are a nurse, they are a physician, they moonlight as the people, and they're like your therapist while you're in the room actually interacting with the investigational product. And when that person changes, the entire visit flow changes, right? Like the routine that you've developed. Maybe they know how to do an assessment that goes a little faster than sort of what the book or sort of what the protocol says, and makes the patient's life just a little easier. Like those like human touches are what make being in a study tolerable for a patient. Yeah. And so when it comes to sort of how we advise our companies and how we talk to our companies like Nkarta and others, is you have to start with the end user, right? How is that, like map out that experience start to finish, and sort of figure out where the pain points are going to be with patient input along the way. Right. Yes, it requires time, it requires some resource, but in the grand scheme of things, the cost of operating your company far outweighs anything you'll do from a patient engagement perspective at any point along the line. And so that extra time and that extra effort from leadership, from the ops team, from the office of the CMO, from medical affairs, is so essential to getting it right, so that once the trial does leave the station, or once the train does leave the station, the risk of falling off the tracks is limited.
When Gunnar talks about the human touch, Gunnar convinced me to write an op-ed on providing fertility services to women who want fertility services because they're worried if they get chemotherapy or fludarabine that they might need those. So we offer those. Guess what? That slows down the trial a little bit. So what, right? I think 3 or 4 women have asked us to do that. So it's a service that is very much appreciated that we're even offering it. We offer doggy daycare. We offer kid daycare. We offer husband and wife spousal travel with the patient. When this man was treating in his community center and had patients staying overnight, we would pay the hotel visit we had a patient come from Venezuela, right? Argentina, sorry. And they had family in the area, but they had to stay at that time, the protocol made them stay in the area for 30 days within a 60-mile radius. Now that went away last week, so yesterday was the last time this man had an overnight stay patient. Now they're all coming in, they only have to stay for an hour after he doses them, and they can go back. But those services that we offer just help those patients and added to what he was doing. So the child care, the travel, and by the way, patients give up their jobs to go into a clinical trial. They have to take time off, and so we offer reimbursement for that. And it's legal, and you have to go through all kinds of hoops to get this in the protocol and get approved by the RBs. But the more you do for the patient and make their life a little easier, the better it's going to be for the trialist as well. And then the patient feels like, well, I'm getting cared for here like I'm going to my community physician versus going into an institution. That's the holy grail, is when the patient gets it and we're focused on the patient and the patient walks in and says, I'm here because I want to be here.
Right.
Right?
Dr. Valenzuela, let's talk a little bit about that holy grail of trust.
Yeah.
You're a clinician, you're a researcher. You see many patients in your clinic that are women of color and of all different types of socioeconomic backgrounds. The trust element is really key. How do you and your staff go forward to build that trust and to create that relationship?
I understand the historical elements related to reasons why patients of certain ethnic types were reluctant to being in clinical trials. But I never thought in those terms, because when you deliver a message to a patient, is is the message to the patient. The patient will understand you, will trust you. In fact, we're proud to be the largest enrollers in a belimumab trial that was in the a trial that was following the registration trial that required patients of Black ethnicity as self-defined to provide additional statistical power to the bias selection that was in the original study, which was mostly Caucasians and Asian patients. So I was the largest recruiter in that trial. So, then I asked myself, what is the reason for that? My staff, my doctors, we don't do anything different. We just talk to the patients, represent the merits of the drug that will be receiving. We discuss everything. So reaching to that population is extremely important because we know they are. Look at every study. It's always the final line in the manuscript is, well, even though the patient met his primary endpoints, the representation in the racial components could have been better. So we strive to get to those communities. I volunteer. I run a indigent clinical rheumatology practice at the city hospital that has a special program for these patients, and they're very grateful for having the opportunity to be considered, and then in a trial if that would be the case. So having those populations in mind to us is extremely important because it does provide justice to the mission that we have as physicians.
In the position you sit in and the things that you help advise on, especially innovation and hope for the future for many of these patients, how, in your mind, is this working now for academic medical centers versus community sites?
I think it's highly dependent to the indication, highly dependent to the therapeutic area, but to the extent that sort of like we're talking about making trials more accessible, convenient, and available to patients in the context of autoimmune, the reality is a lot of those autoimmune patients are being treated in the clinic by physicians they know, the physicians they trust, and physicians within their physicians' network. And that is sort of the root, I think, of the magic here. And so my call out to industry and sort of people in this room are, from the sponsor side of the wall, you got to go to where your patients are, right? And that comes back to sort of the thing that we were talking about earlier where, maybe it's not Harvard, maybe it's not Columbia, maybe it's, not, MD Anderson. And instead it's, the community clinic that is seeing 35 patients a week, but all 35 of those patients have a desire to be in a clinical trial one day. That's the root of accessibility here.
So, Paul, in that spirit of, future forward and making this a better landscape, what, tell us about Nkarta's hub and spoke model and how you think whether that applies, to Dr. Valenzuela for referral from other community rheumatologists versus forming their own.
Dr. Valenzuela and Iris is a hub, and there are spokes that go out into South Florida and actually Puerto Rico, Argentina, he mentioned. So we sent him to one of our spokes, and he walked in the spoke, and he came out, and he said, no, not this one, that one. They're not going to be able to do this. They can, right? So the hub and spoke model is feeding centers like Iris. If a community rheumatologist is intimidated to give cell therapy, they're worried about CRS or whatever, they can go to him, and so he's the hub, and the spoke then sends their patients to him. We'll pay for that travel and do all that stuff. So those patients, we put them in what we call a patient funnel, and then the patient funnel, those patients, we pick sites where they should go, and I always pick his site because of the way they treat patients, right? That's where I want our funnel patients to go, so he gets all the funnel patients. By the way, there are a bunch of clinical community research centers out there in strip malls. They're not the ones you want to be going to, right? These so-called, factories, right? You want to go to his center, right, where there are people there that are trained, and you have to have a trained rheumatologist to assess the patient. You have to have a trained a person that can administer cell therapy, even though it's like an antibody, you have to, monitor that patient carefully. So the spokes feed into the hubs, and then the hubs get the patients, and then eventually the spokes might learn from the hub how to become that next community hospital that says, you know what, I can do a clinical trial in Putnam, Connecticut.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely. Absolutely. Let us show this terrific panel our appreciation for their transparency and passion. Thank you so much.